Well, hey guys, thank you to all my subscribers for coming back and supporting the channel. And if you're new here, welcome. So in the last video, we talked about the 13 colonies, and we're going to continue talking about colonial times. So now we're moving past the beginning of the 13 colonies, and we're just discussing what life was like in the colonies and maybe some important people that were living in the colonies. And so grab yourself a drink, grab yourself a seat, and let's get started. So the first three books I'm sharing comes from the Library of Living and Working in Colonial Times. So this is a series of books about different types of people and the types of jobs that they would have if they were living in the colonies. And this one is A Day in the Life of a Colonial Doctor, A Day in the Life of a Colonial Wig Maker, and A Day in the Life of a Colonial Silversmith. There was another one that was called A Day in the Life of a indigo planter or something to that effect. I did read through that one. Unfortunately, I had to return it to the library because I get all these from the library. So I don't have that one here, but it was also a good book. So the reason that I picked these books, I picked them for different reasons. So this one, A Day in the Life of a Wig Maker, my daughter's into fashion. I thought she would find it interesting what a wig maker would be doing in a colony. And then this one, A Day in the Life of a Colonial Silversmith, we are going to be talking about Paul Revere. And so I thought she would be interested in learning more about what a silversmith would do in the colonies. And then this one, A Day in the Life of a Colonial Doctor. I picked this one out first, specifically because we have a direct connection to the very first colony of Jamestown, and I mentioned that in my previous video. And so to give you a little bit more background, the first family member of ours to come to North America was a doctor. And so because I'm going to be telling my daughter more about our family tree and family history, I wanted her to think about what life would be like for a doctor in the 13 colonies. Now, I also thought it would be an interesting perspective because a doctor's life in the colonies would probably be a lot different than how other people in the colonies were living. And so that's also another reason I liked that this series of books had different professions, so you could see what different people were living like. And so this book in particular, I won't go through all three of these, but they are stories that also include factual information, but I will talk about this one a little bit. So this one is about a man named Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, a doctor in the colonies, and he had signed the Declaration of Independence, and it goes through and it talks about what his life was like and the things that he did for people in the colonies. I found it very interesting. It was a good book. I recommend all of the books in the series, at least the ones that I've read. And to give you a little bit more background, I mentioned that the first family member of our family who came to North America was a doctor, and more specifically, he was a surgeon. And he traveled from Europe to the Americas, and he settled with his family in Jamestown. Now, before he left Europe, he and his family, they bounced around Europe, and they ended up moving to England because he knew that once they lived in England, they could get on a boat and come over to the Americas, and that's what he wanted to do. I don't know if his family wanted to do that, but the interesting part of the story is once he got to Britain, the British government or somebody there said, yeah, we'll send you to the colonies, the Americas, but you have to be a farmer. And he was like, but I don't know how to farm. I'm a doctor. And they were like, well, now you're both. And so they said, if you want to go to the colonies, you need to be a farmer and a doctor. And I don't exactly know what ended up happening as far as farming when he arrived in Jamestown. I imagine that the people of Jamestown were probably like, yeah, no, we need a doctor. So just be a doctor. So our family member came about 100 years after Jamestown was founded. So he came around the 1700s, or around 1700, I should say. And yeah, he started working as a doctor there. And he came with his family and his wife and a cousin and their family, and either a brother or another cousin in their family. So a lot of family members came, and they all survived the trip on the boat. So I think like the voyage to go from Europe to North America had improved because they all survived. Unfortunately, some of his children and his wife did pass away later on. And at the time that they settled in Jamestown, Virginia, the colony, the whole state of Virginia, wasn't a state yet, but the Virginia colony, there was a total of 60,000 people there. So I say that so that you can get an idea of how many people were there at that time. And one other interesting thing was that even though he was a doctor, sometimes people were not able to pay him for his services. And so what I found in the family history is that sometimes he would be paid with a slave. And that's a difficult thing to say, to find out, to know that somebody was paying him with a person. And so slaves were seen as currency. But that's a fact, and that was documented. Now, and it was a surprise because I'm like, this man was a doctor. But did he own slaves? That I'm not so sure of. I just know people tried to pay him that way if they couldn't pay him any other way. Now, the next two books are about Ben Franklin. So this is somebody who was important in history and important to the colonies. And I'm sure you all know about Ben Franklin, but this book is about Ben Franklin's childhood. So this is Ben Franklin and his first kite. And while he is an inventor, and I could put this into the American Inventors section of my book list, which, if you don't know, I like to have at least one inventor, American inventor, to talk about each month with my daughter. Anyway, even though Ben Franklin was an inventor, I have a different inventor in mind, but I wanted to talk about Ben Franklin because he was such a unique person. I really feel like he was almost one of a kind type of person because he came up with so many inventions. But anyhow, so this first book is about his childhood and how he floated across a lake using just a kite. And it is a level 2 reader. So if you're looking for a reader for your child to practice reading, this could be a good one. And it talks about how Ben Franklin helped his uncle in his candle factory. His uncle would make candles, and so Ben, as a young boy, would help him. But Ben always had different ideas in his head. And after he was done helping his uncle, he would run home and then he'd run out again and try to do all these experiments that he had going on in his mind. And in this book, he was trying to show how he could use wind and a kite to float himself across a lake without having to swim at all. And his friends didn't believe that he could do that. They were like, "You're a madman." And he said, "Watch me do it. If I'm correct, I think I'll be able to go all the way across." And of course, he does, and his friends are very impressed. And this book, Now and Ben, I thought was really well done. It talks about all the different inventions that he came up with. And so one of them was printing a cartoon in a newspaper. He also made glasses. He also found out about electricity. And let's see here. He also invented this thing to reach out and grab things. And I like how it shows how things are being used now and how he figured it out and how it was used in the past. Now, one thing that I did want to mention about Ben Franklin was when he was flying a kite and he discovered electricity, the nature of electricity. And oftentimes you hear this story, but one thing that I did not know was that his son was there for this experiment. In fact, his son was there for all of his experiments. And so his son's name was William, and it was his firstborn child. But Ben had his son William out of wedlock, out of marriage, and he went ahead and took his son William in and, raised him up. And so every time he had some crazy experiment or crazy idea, his son was always right beside him. And they became the best of friends, from what I understand from reading. And then eventually his son became the governor of the colony of New Jersey. And unfortunately, later in life, William and Ben, their relationship got fractured, and it ended terribly, actually. But it just goes to show me, anyway, that life is complicated. People are complicated, and history is complicated too. But I always wondered why didn't anyone ever mention that his son was there for all of his experiments? And I thought that was pretty interesting. Okay, and so then the next book is called Revolutionary Mary, The True Story of a Woman, the Declaration of Independence, and America's Fight for Freedom. So this book caught my eye because I never knew this. And it's about a woman named Mary Catherine Goddard. And she ended up printing a newspaper. And she would print the Declaration of Independence onto towels because it was difficult to find paper back then. And so sometimes she would just get like hand towels, and people would give these hand towels or paper to her, people in the colonies that supported a revolution and breaking away from England and the British Crown. And so what she did was considered treasonous back then. But she was very bold, and she just went ahead and printed out what different things that some of the revolutionary people would want her to print out, and she would go around and post it in public places. And whenever she printed something, she would put her initials on it, so nobody knew that it was a woman who was printing these things. And so when they made the declaration, she went ahead and put the declaration up all over all over the colony, and she signed her name at the bottom of the Declaration. So she's the only woman with her name on the Declaration of Independence, which I thought was very interesting. I had never heard that before. And so the next book is called Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. This book is by Stephen Krensky. I know there's several of these Paul Revere Midnight Ride type books, and I believe there's like a poem by Longfellow, but this one is by Stephen Krensky, and I liked it. I thought it gave a good a little bit of a background of Paul Revere, and also takes you through maybe what he was feeling and what others were feeling at the time that he does his famous midnight ride, where he tells people the British are coming, he's sounding an alarm. And so if you don't know about Paul Revere, he lived in the colony of Boston, and he was a silversmith. But along with being a silversmith, he was also involved in political matters, and he was chosen as the person who would sound the alarm if, there was trouble, and which he did. And so this book goes through him going through town warning people, and then of course it talks about the tower and where they had the light, where they had one or two lights or lanterns, that would tell them if the British were coming by boat or by land, by sea or by land. And so it's your traditional story of Paul Revere. And I think the illustrations are well done, and the writing is well done. Nothing gruesome in here. It does talk about how, this leads to a war, the Revolutionary War, but there's nothing gruesome in here. So definitely something that you could talk about. It does show, a little bit of battle, but it doesn't show anything terrible. Okay, and so the next few books are going to be about the story of Sacajawea and also of Lewis and Clark's expedition. So after the Declaration of Independence and the Boston Tea Party and the Revolutionary War, we're going to go into Sacajawea. This one is another ready-to-read book. This one's also by Stephen Krensky. This book I felt like really has nothing to do with Sacajawea. It's just like, a made-up story, but it is a good story. And if you're looking for a level 2 book, just something for your kids to read, they might enjoy this. It talks about Sacajawea as a child, and she helps her grandmother. They're going to collect some wood for her mother or their tribe, and a boulder comes down, and then the grandma twists her ankle, and then a snake tries to bite her, and Sacajawea is a brave girl and helps her grandmother. The next two books are about Sacajawea. This one is a picture book of Sacajawea by David Adler. David Adler makes a lot of historical books. This book about Lewis and Clark is also by David Adler. And there is another book about George Washington that is written by David Adler. I don't have it here. I read through it. It just gives your very basic overview of George Washington and his life. Nothing fancy, but it was an all right book. I just don't have it because I had to return it. And so we are going to talk about George Washington also because he becomes the first president. So I'm going to include George Washington in here. So if you're looking for a book, George Washington by David Adler, it's a good book. So this one is about Sacajawea, and starts off when she's a child, talks about how she was captured by a rival tribe, the Hidasta, and she becomes a slave to the Hidasta tribe, and then she is sold to a Frenchman named Toussaint Charbonneau. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But anyhow, so he buys her because he wants a second wife. So he already has a wife and a family with children, but he decides he's gonna leave them, and so he purchases Sacajawea, who at the time was 14 or 15 years old, and Mr. Charbonneau was 40. And that kind of, I'm just gonna leave it there. You guys can do what you want with that information. Maybe have a discussion with your older kids about it. After a while, the U.S. government wants to expand westward, and he finds out about it, and he's like, hey, yeah, we can help you with that. He talks to Lewis and Clark, who are leading the expedition, and so they join this expedition, and Sacajawea and Charbonneau are supposed to be interpreters. So obviously Sacajawea would be the interpreters for the Native Americans side of things, and Charbonneau was French, so he could speak French, and so he was supposed to translate on that side of things. But it turned out that Charbonneau was not a good translator, and he was not a good person. And in fact, everybody on the expedition basically hated Charbonneau, and Lewis and Clark wrote about that in their journals, about how much they disliked him and what a terrible person he was, which I find interesting that they would take the time, both of them, to write this. And in fact, they said the only good thing about Charbonneau was that he could cook. However, Lewis and Clark took a liking to Sacajawea. And one thing I forgot to mention was that Sacajawea was 15 years old. Okay, she was 14, I believe, when she got married. 15, she had a baby. And later on that year is when they started the expedition. So she had only had the baby for like 2 or 3 months before they set out on this expedition that took 3 years. And I was like, what? Because I don't, like, there's no way, guys. Like, okay, maybe I was hiking when my daughter was 2 months, 3 months old, but there's no way that I would be going on a 3-year expedition with the 2-month-old baby. So props to her for doing that. So there's her and her baby. And Sacajawea was really like leading the expedition because she was helping a lot with medicine when people got ill. She would hunt. She would I think help make food. And there's a story where they come to a fort and they have to stay a few months at the fort. I believe it's during the winter time, and Sacajawea shows Lewis and Clark and others how to make moccasins. And so they spend that winter making loads and loads of moccasins. And so then at the end of the story, the whole idea was to go from east to west, find some sort of a water route if they could, and see what was on the western side, which was the ocean. And Sacajawea wanted to go see the ocean, and at the end she does see the ocean, and then Lewis and Clark, their expedition is over and they leave, and Sacajawea leaves as well. However, I did read that I believe it was Clark or Lewis, I don't remember, one of the two. She ends up moving on to their property. They have like a big ranch or something, lots of property. Her and her husband move on to this ranch. They live there, they garden, and then her husband, Toussaint, Charbonneau, excuse me, he decides, he's leaving, and he goes up to Canada to do fur trading because he was originally a fur trader. And he leaves Sacajawea, and Sacajawea, she decides to go back and live with the Shoshone people. It's unclear if she ever makes it to her tribe or not, but she leaves her son either with Lewis or Clark, I don't remember which, and she goes back to her tribe. And unfortunately, Sacajawea dies at the age of 24, 25 years old. But some people say she passes away with the Shoshone people. Some people say she passed away before then. And so as a side note, I bought this coloring book, The Story of Sacajawea. It's by Dover Coloring Books. I thought this was well done. So, it's got some text down at the bottom that you can read, and then it has some nice pictures if your kids want to color it. I just think this is nice for the information. It's like a really quick review of everything. And then this book, a picture book of Lewis and Clark, really just details more of Lewis and Clark, how they knew each other, how they met, how they decided to go on this expedition. And I wouldn't say their point of view of the expedition, but it's more like that, yeah. Like what kind of troubles they had on the expedition. And it really does not talk about Sacajawea in this book very much. But interestingly, a lot of times people view Lewis and Clark as, some kind of heroes, and they think that they thought that Sacajawea, which by the way, didn't receive any form of payment or anything for doing the expedition. So Lewis and Clark, they believe that Sacajawea should have got some kind of a reward or payment, but Toussaint Charbonneau, her husband, was the one who received land and received money, and Sacajawea received nothing, and not even recognition until much, much later. And Lewis and Clark did believe that was wrong, but at the same time, Lewis and Clark, they didn't pay her. So I don't know the full story there, but there's a little bit of, there's more to the story of Lewis and Clark. But I thought this was a well-written book overall. The next book is about Davy Crockett. It's called Davy Crockett, Life on the Frontier. It's a ready-to-read level 3, and it is by Stephen Krensky. So this is about a man named Davy Crockett, who, if you're not familiar with him, he was a frontiersman and adventurer, and later on becomes a politician. And so the book goes through his life as a child all the way up to an adult. And in the beginning, it talks about some tall tales surrounding his childhood. And Davy Crockett seems to have a lot of tall tales around his history. And the reason why I think is because he himself liked to tell tall tales. It's kind of what he's known for a little bit. But he was charming, he loved telling stories, and he was bold, and people really liked that about him. So in chapter 1, it talks about him being a baby, and then it goes on to talk about his life farming and herding cattle, making money for his family. And then as a young child, he gets into some trouble at school, and he really doesn't like school, and he leaves school. But then as a young adult, he learns how to hunt and fish, and that's when he becomes a frontiersman. And as a frontiersman, he becomes good friends with Native American tribes and Native American people, and he respects them a lot. And as he grows up, he realizes he does need an education, and it is important to read and write. And so he goes back to school, and he ends up running for political office. And the colonists really liked him. They thought, like I said, he was entertaining, and he was bold, and they just liked him, so they would vote for him. And so he held political office, and eventually he became a congressman. He was voted into Congress. And when he was in Congress, he meets Andrew Jackson, who becomes president. And somehow they knew each other prior to that. They're both from Tennessee. They both were in the military. But he butts heads with Andrew Jackson quite a lot. And the reason why is because he didn't agree with the ideas that Andrew Jackson had with westward expansion and removing Native Americans from their lands. And he told everybody that he didn't think it was right, and he told everyone, including Andrew Jackson himself. However, there's also a story about where they were both at some sort of political meeting, and Davy Crockett sees somebody who is going to kill Andrew Jackson, and he stops that from happening, wrestles the guy to the ground, punches him, knocks him out, or something like that, and he saves Andrew Jackson's life. And later, Davy Crockett commented on that, and he said, even though I disagree with the guy, I don't want to see him dead. And so even after all of that happened, he served as a congressman for many years, but then the Congress people, I believe, I'm not sure, it may have just been that he wasn't reelected, but I believe that the congressman booted him out of Congress, and he was pretty upset by that. And something that he said, and he's known for a lot of different sayings, but one thing that supposedly he said was, y'all can go to heck, I'm going to Texas. And so if that gives you any idea of what his personality was like, there you go. But overall, I thought this book was pretty good. It has, like I said, a mixture of tall tales and also some facts about Davy Crockett, and the illustrations are good and the writing's good too. And then the last book that I want to share is called The Boo-Boos That Changed the World, a true story about an accidental invention. Really? And so this story is about Band-Aids. And it talks about a man and his wife, a man named Earl and his wife named Josephine, who lived in New Jersey. And Earl worked for a medical device company called Johnson & Johnson. And he was newly married. His wife was always cooking in the kitchen, but she was accident prone. And anytime he would come home, he would be excited to have this meal that she cooked for him. And then he'd see how she was all cut up and burned. And he was like, I need to do something for her because she's really gets a lot of cuts and she's accident prone. And I just thought that was so sweet. And so he thought day and night about what he could do to help his wife with all these cuts that she would get while she was cooking. And he came up with the Band-Aid, the very first Band-Aid. And so it goes through his thought process, his ideas, and then he brings up the idea to his boss, Mr. Johnson, and, Band-Aids were created, but they weren't a hit. People didn't like them at first, and then eventually they do become a hit. And they give the Band-Aids to Boy Scouts and soldiers and World War II, and then Band-Aids take off and spread all over the world, and to this day people use Band-Aids, and I just thought that was a sweet story. And then for poetry, I know that I said I was going to mention a poetry book this time, and I like Julie Andrews' Treasury of Poems. I believe that's what it's called. I don't have the book here because I checked it out from the library, had to return it, but an excellent, excellent poetry book. It goes through the seasons. It has poetry for each season, and it's just a collection of different poems from different authors. Great poetry book. Very thick poetry book though. So if you get it, you could probably use it for the whole year because there's that many poems in it. So I'm going to leave you with this book, The Boo-Boos That Changed the World, because this was our favorite book. My daughter loved this book. So did I. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video book list, and I hope that you can incorporate some of these books into your learning, and I will see you in the next video.